Pacific affairs. And I'd also like to echo the sentiments in the lovely acknowledgement of country you folks gave when we started. So our session, Pacific Education Transformations, I feel like I need to explain the title. You may be wondering, why not put a question mark at the end to problematize the notion that these transformations are actually happening? That would be the academic-y thing to do. Why even choose the word transformations anyway? Well, by leaving the question mark off, I was reacting to critical education literature. I've read a lot of it, and I often find scholars quick to point out that nothing ever seems to change. We have increasingly sophisticated tools to show the ways that schooling perpetuates social inequality. I do value that suspicion of schooling. I think it's important to know who and what is being left behind when policies are enacted and devised. But I do want to be able to identify change when it is happening, so I've written an assertive title to try and orient the panellists towards examples of change. Then why transformations? Surely rethinking would have been a better word. Rethinking has a strong heritage in Pacific education literature, and it still has resonance among many Pacific educators today. Among those who know, the term rethinking would call to mind the ongoing effort to design education systems and curricula to better reflect the cultures and knowledges of Pacific peoples. So far as I'm aware, rethinking was first used at the turn of the century by the Rethinking Pacific Education Initiative for Pacific Peoples by Pacific Peoples. The Pacific Island scholars involved have produced insightful and invaluable work on Pacific education. But personally, I'm reluctant to go down that path because the rethinking is being done by Pacific people on their own terms and in their own terms. A rethought Pacific education isn't accountable to standards that I could apply to it. Instead, I hope that transformations without the question mark might turn the attention of our panellists towards action, to what men, women and young people are doing with education. I've been able to observe something like that. During my dissertation research, I lived at secondary boarding schools in Bougainville and Solomon Islands, and I wanted to know how young people and their teachers were able to live together again peacefully after civil conflict. A lot of the answer had to do with what students and teachers said they were doing with schooling. Teachers were very open about the fact that academic success was only one part of what they were doing. For many, it seemed inconceivable that a student could finish school and not be able to live well on their ancestral land. They thought about and put in place activities that encouraged young people to value rural life and custom. The result was that many of the taken for granted components of daily life at school were at various times transformed into something else. Sports grounds, staff rooms and dormitories became neutral ground for reconciliation ceremonies. Staff meetings were successful when they became reconciliation-like events for a community of teachers. Assembly halls hosted cultural performances. Immediate and extended family and even community events were allowed to intrude on daily life at school and respected when they did. As I saw it, these were transformation of the school into something else, and were sometimes even refusals to prioritise test scores, classroom learning and the requirements of government over the relationships between people and community. And they supported peace building in Solomon Islands and Bougainville. The burning question for me then was, how far do these transformations go? Do they extend beyond the schools I visited into other educational institutions and policy formation processes? If they do, what effects are they having and what can be learnt about the enduring interest in education and value of education in the region from those effects? The four women we'll hear from today are well placed to provide answers to these questions, to scope the boundaries and limitations of transformations to formal schooling, or to shed light on its possibilities and potential. First, we'll stay in Solomon Islands as Deborah McDougall, a sociocultural anthropologist based at the University of Melbourne, tells us about the Kulu Language Institute, a remarkable language movement based in Ranonga, Western Province, which she's been following for many years. If you've ever heard Deborah speak about Kulu, or if you've ever heard its founder, Alpheus Zobule, speak about Kulu, you'll have likely been amazed at just how profound the changes have been for Kulu students. After Deborah, we'll leave Solomon Islands for the classrooms of New Caledonia, but return to my research topic. Clara Filippi, a PhD student based in Noumea and a visiting fellow with us at DPA, will tell us about a project so topical it's been incredibly difficult for her to pin down. Clara, having worked in civil society in New Caledonia on these issues, is investigating how New Caledonia's own violent past is transmitted or not to the next generation. If there are transformations for the better occurring in New Caledonia's schools at this moment, there must surely be hope in other places. Next, back to Solomon Islands, but international level issues concerning higher education. Dr. Patricia Rhodey, Dean of the Faculty of Education and Humanities at Solomon Islands National University, has formidable experience in just about all levels of education, from classroom teaching, research in schools, teacher training, and education reform and administration. She's going to tell us about current activities underway at SINU that a new Education Act in Solomon Islands has set in motion. And then from the national level to the region. Rebecca Spratt has been working in education development in the Pacific for more than 2 decades and will tell us about the Pacific Regional Education Framework, PACREF. She'll take up the question of whether or not PACREF does represent a transformation in regional policy collaboration. And these insights will be fresh. Her PhD thesis passed without revision while we were organising this panel. My notes do say wait for the applause. And without any more, I'll hand over to Deborah.
Thank you, David. Korporani Jongana, good morning, or good afternoon. And I wanted to say how grateful I am to be here on Ngunnawal land, putting a few little footprints on the ground swept so beautifully by Auntie Vanessa at the Welcome to Country. So for about 7 decades, we've known that kids learn best when they start in their first language, or really any language they know. Indeed, the more time spent learning a familiar language, the better they will be able to move on to whatever is the language of national or global prestige that everyone wants to know. And yet most Solomon Island students, particularly in rural areas, learn to read and write in a language that no one in their lives speaks, not their parents, not their peers, not even usually their teachers. And that they usually have only a fuzzy understanding of. In a really profound way, this sets them up for failure, not just in school, but in many ways in life. The 2023 Education Act in Solomon Island formally allows what had been happening for many years, which is instruction in local languages, usually Solomon Islands Pidgin, where teachers figure out a way to communicate with the students in their classrooms in languages they know. And yet those kids are not learning to read, write, analyze Pidgin or any of the many languages that they speak. A 2010 language policy, beautiful language policy, makes a strong case for the positive benefit of teaching children to read, write, and analyze languages in formal schooling. And as we heard from Dr. Transform last night, there's some momentum nationally around integrating Indigenous and exogenous, the local and the global, in many aspects of learning. And yet, for language instruction, there's no clearly articulated vision, let alone plan or program of work about how this might happen. And indeed, there's some formidable barriers to vernacular language education being rolled out around the country. Understanding of these barriers are critical for any kind of realistic plan. There are, first, logistical barriers in a country with 60, 70 languages, depending on how you count, and a formal education system that, to be frank, struggles with materials in one language. It's almost unrealistic to expect centralized production and rollout of vernacular language materials. Moreover, in most communities, especially urban, but also rural communities, there's not a single language. There are multiple Indigenous languages, and people are complexly and vibrantly multilingual. A second barrier, knowledge barriers. And Leonora and my senior SINU colleagues can correct me if I'm wrong, but very few, if any, people who become teachers have any experience studying indigenous languages, local languages, Solomon Island Pidgin, the shared vernacular of the language of the country. Language education, if I understand it, is English language education. Conversely, those who know their languages best are not trained teachers. In fact, they're often those who've not been to school. Those who bridge that gap, most importantly, I think, are those who've been doing work in Bible translation, as we'll hear more of later. And finally, a barrier I think isn't talked about enough are ideological barriers. Ideologies, ideas about what schooling is for and what language is for can really be a barrier to integrating vernacular language education in formal schooling. Parents, teachers, students, communities, government leaders, donors, almost all agree that the purpose of schooling is getting a job. Getting a job requires fluency in English. Ordinary people are likely to think that going to school and studying your own language is a waste of time. There's some cautionary tales, too, around the integration or rolling out vernacular language programs. And I'd point to Angela Terrell, who's just written a first part of a wonderful in brief on this challenge. Both PNG's bilingual education program and a pilot project instigated in Solomon Islands after that 2010 policy illustrate how difficult and indeed sometimes counterproductive top-down centralized approaches to vernacular education, language education can be. So in PNG, transitional bilingual education program that was established in the 90s and praised in the early 2000s as really a leading example of this kind of multilingual education, emerged from grassroots, on-the-ground programs, many associated with Bible translations through SIL. But it was rolled out top-down pretty quickly without teacher training, without, importantly, shifting those community attitudes, without quality curriculum materials. So when kids kept failing at school, it was blamed by a wide range of folks on the fact that they weren't getting to English quickly enough. So I think that's still ticking away, but not really flourishing. The other cautionary tale comes from Solomon Islands. Pilot project in language groups from the southeastern Solomon, Sa and Narosi. These were trial programs, rolled out according to the evaluation really well, with beautiful materials, very thoughtful programs, and a lot of good training. But then the overtaxed and overstressed folks at the Ministry of Education and Resources didn't have the capacity to keep supporting that. And it took many years, I think nearly a decade, to even get the evaluation to continue on. And most of those programs, they succeeded in actually shifting attitudes on the ground, but they died without the ongoing support that was their origin. Where the effects lasted were in the shifting ideas in the community, and also the teachers who had been trained. So some of the teachers who had gone through this and learned to work in and through their own languages kept doing that inside their English language classrooms. And indeed, another legacy has been a school that's totally outside of for the formal schooling system. So in light of the barriers and the cautionary tales, it seems to me that the really most promising way forward for bringing vernacular language into formal schooling, so these kids are not set up for failure, is to lean on communities and to lean on community-led language movements. And with this, I turn to the remarkable work of the Kulu Language Institute, which Dr. Transform mentioned last night as one of the living labs that the SINU Institute of Island Futures will engage with. Kulu, which was established and continues to be directed by Alpheus Zombuli, who's written another, yesterday published in brief on the Kulu Language Institute, addresses at least some of those barriers, ideological knowledge, and logistical barriers that I've just mentioned. So, for those of you who don't know Solomon Islands well, we are in the western part of the Solomon Islands, the far west, over there in Ranonga. Those involved are from the two language groups of Ranonga as well as Simbo. So there's a kind of quite closely related little language chain. Kulu comes from Kumbakota and Lunga, the two languages spoken on Ranonga, and it originated in the late 1990s as Alpheus was translating the New Testament into his first language, Lunga, down in Lale and the Lunga area. And like many translators, Dr. Zombule realized that people who understood, spoke the language, couldn't read or write it, and started to develop literacy materials to be used in his mother's home village of Saivuke, a place that has never and still doesn't have a primary school. So with his cousin John Tengana, he started to develop materials, and Tengana pushed him to write those materials in a way that ordinary unschooled people of Saivuke could understand. But Dr. Zombule being who he is, and John Tengana being who he is, they didn't stop at the sort of basic literacy, let's get an ability to sound out words. They thought that these unschooled villagers could really dig into and intellectually analyze their own language. And so over a decade, Dr. Zombule, not yet a doctor at that point, developed a sort of 8-volume, 1,000 words corpus of texts, all in Lunga, describing Lunga. Tengana and the other pioneers carried these books around, pushed them into church meetings and community meetings, and gradually this interest in vernacular language grew, and a campus, land was donated for a campus. In the mid-2000s, in the 2010s, there was a shift, and young people started to flock to the Kulu Institute. I've done about 70 or so interviews with these students, 3 kind of key reasons. One are the folks who've been really, really left behind, who are ridiculed by others as stoneheads. And so they come because the Kulu Institute has a reputation for helping those left behind to open their brain. Probably the majority come for what they say, upgrade in education blumi. There's a sense they understand English, words, but not how it's structured, and so grammar's can help them in school. And then another is a kind of young people, especially young men, who've maybe finished secondary school and don't know what they're gonna do and don't have a job and are searching for something. And this one helps with those kind of climbing the credential ladder, but also really gives them a sense of who they are and the value of their languages. The most recent development has been the opening, not of this kind of college-level curriculum digging into the grammar, but folks who've trained, the thousands who've trained through the Kulu Institute, going back to their communities and opening language schools, not just about language, but really a kind of a whole curriculum, math and other things. These schools, and we went around opening some of them earlier just this year. This is Dr. Zombule's home place in Bebea. They sit in some cases alongside primary and secondary schools, as in the case of this one in Lale. In other places, there still are no schools, so it's the only school within reasonable walking distance for little kids, but it's not just for little kids, it's for whoever, so not age-graded like formal schools. Now, these schools are not structurally integrated or recognized by formal education in Solomon Islands. And in some ways, that's a good thing because they've got strong roots in communities, and so it has built over 20 years without really any significant outsider support, and that gives it a kind of integrity And people do it not because they're paid, but because it's their kids and it's their futures. It's open, it's not kind of the teachers are trained within the language movement, not according to external criteria, and there's real local control. On the other hand, there is actually strong connection with the community schools because, as I've mentioned, students are going back and forth. They're coming in their holidays. They're taking that into their classes. When teachers in the 2010s saw that their students who'd been to Kulu were actually doing better in all kinds of ways in school, they started coming and sitting beside their students in the kind of short, intensive Kulu classes. So what are the possibilities for perhaps letting formal education kind of lean more strongly onto this or other movements? One thing, it would be nice if there was enough recognition and interaction that kids who maybe went to a school in their own language didn't go to year 1, but could jump into mid-primary school. Another might be, what about kind of recognizing the teachers who, on their own time and on their own dollars, went and built their education by engaging with this language institute or with other kind of culturally grounded movements that have grown out of local soil across the country. In fact, while this is grounded in Ranonga and really speaking to Ranonga and Simbo, it's diffusing around the country because in recent years, people from other language groups have come and are trying to model that and plant the sort of seed in their own places. So Simbo, but also Choiseul and all around the place. And that is more strongly enabled because while establishing Kulu Language Institute, Dr. Zombule also established Island Bible Ministries, which I like to think of as the first liberal arts college in Solomon Islands, very text-focused, and has inspired others to want to emulate that in their home areas, and is doing locally driven Bible translation that is the kind of reaching out language skills across the country. But in terms of a country-level program, the idea of translating materials in the ministry and sending them out isn't sustainable, isn't realistic. But if you've got these kind of growing movements around the country, what about a model that provides some guidelines and templates, but allows people to write their own stories in their own languages? It doesn't have to be the same. And then finally, I think, looking towards the higher education sector, and especially Solomon Islands National University, embedding linguistics of Solomon Islands languages in teacher training, so that teachers, even if they're teaching in an English classroom, have a sense of the differences amongst languages, the ways that English and Pidgin is different than Pidgin and the Austronesian, non-Austronesian languages of the country. And Dr. Transform talked about a Island Futures, Institute Center for Islands Futures with a language component to perhaps bring together the community-led work, the teachers, which I think are really the core of that community connection, and policymakers and teachers. And finally, other places in the world have Indigenous-led, community-led language schools that have various degrees of recognition from formal schooling in Aotearoa, New Zealand, even here in Australia, and other kind of settler colonial places, and it might be worth looking at those examples. Thank you.
Hi everyone, and thank you for having me here. So I will first begin by explaining the title that I chose. This quotation is from the Nouméa Agreement, has a crucial importance in New Caledonia because it acknowledges the colonization and also because it tries to strike a balance between the damage of the colonization and the positive contribution, suggesting a search for a common point between the different parties. So this is also the aim of this presentation, to highlight the positive aspect of the New Caledonian school system and to raise issues that may hinder the reconciliation process. First, I need to explain quickly the memory issue in New Caledonia to understand what can be the school roles. Memory is not necessarily an exact and perfect reflection of the past. It's a trace of it, so memory are malleable, fluctuating, biased, reconstruct, and above all, memories are unique to each individual. So we have several types of memories. Individual memory first, that is to say mine or yours, and it's what we experience and how we as a person remember it. So it's our truth, our experience, our perception, our memory in the grand scheme of things. No one can take our memory away from us, even if it's biased or not. Then there is the collective memory. This is the one that is commonly accepted without too many variations, the one that is common to a group. For example, in Australia, if I talk about James Cook, you will think 1770 when he arrived. But if I talk about James Cook in New Caledonia, another group, people will think differently, about 1853. So time plays a key role in the collective memories, and memory are fluid. Also, there is the official memory, the one that the authority passes on to us through schools, textbooks, commemoration, for example. When we think about World War II, we immediately think to Hitler, the concentration camp, the 6 million Jews killed, because we learned it at school, we celebrated those dates, and so on. On the other hand, the personal anecdote of the war, the one that your grandfather might have tell you maybe, remain individual memories. And official memories, when it's shared by all, becomes history and a symbol of national identity. However, official memories implies that there will be some unofficial memories. Those are not included in the dominant discourse. Those are quieter, underground, forgotten even. Those that Foucault calls subaltern memories. So the question that appears here is, what happens when memories are manipulated? When it's omitting or unfazing all or part of what really happened? When the authorities impose the official version? Then in general, they don't succeed in erasing our memories. Official memory does not override individual memory. If the authorities impose an official version, there is a conflict of memories. But we too manipulate memories, voluntarily or not, but when we refuse to talk about or remember the past, we might manipulate them. This is a crucial issue facing by New Caledonia. It conflicts memories. At this time, memories are hermetically sealed from one to another, depending on the community. Only two of them were tragically mixed during the period known as the event. I often speak about this mosaic of memories. And we can see the same dynamic in the books. So time is long, it's necessary, and it takes a generation. But time alone is not enough. Simply waiting for the victim to move on doesn't work. It's even worse. We hide the truth from the children, often to protect them, but unconsciously, for most scholars, we transmit our emotion to them. They experience and cultivate them, even though they are not their own. Generations pass, but hatred and the desire for revenge remain, and sometimes even grow. and the living together is less and less possible. So government and individual can, over-evaluating the past, silencing completely or partially this past, or taking into account all deviation. It's called the work of memory, le travail de mémoire. We can see this use of memories in the official discourses, in the curriculum, in the textbooks, in the celebration of events and dates. It's what Pierre Nora called lieux de mémoire, memory places. So the question is, how can we build together if we don't remember the same past? Is that possible? Or if our version is totally obscure or even erased? I think that this issue is crucial in New Caledonia, specifically at school. So let's go through the light and the shadows. In my PhD, I analyzed the curriculum and the textbooks, and I was looking for 5 essential points. The topic covered, whether this period is transmitted or not, in which grades, the hours allocated according to the curriculum and in reality, and the volume dedicated to this period in textbooks. And here is what I observed. There is an adaptation of the history and geography curriculum in New Caledonia. New Caledonia and France share this responsibility for managing the school curriculum. As a result, the programs are adapted and contextualized, making it possible to add themes such as the settlement of the archipelago, the role of New Caledonia in Great Wars, pre-European Kanak civilization, the colonial area in New Caledonia, and so on. So it's appeared in the curriculum. In addition, since 2016, a subject has been added to the curriculum, EFCK, fundamental element of Kanak culture. The aim is to cover 6 fundamental elements of Kanak culture: the hut, the clan, the yam, language and speech, the person, earth and space. And there is teaching guides available. And there is the opportunity to learn Kanak language at school. Now let's see the shadows. First, the silence. Simply mentioning this theme in the curriculum does not mean that they are all covered. So it's important to observe how teachers deal with it. The result of my exploration have already shown that the term event, the so-called period known as the Civil War that we call event, only appears in the curriculum for grade 6 and 12. Regarding grade 10, a section titled New Caledonia since 1946 Political Evolution provides an opportunity to address this period, but no mention of the word events or civil war that does not appear anywhere in the curriculum. The same is true for the textbooks. The emphasis is on the agreement that led to peace rather than on what actually happened during this period. Some themes are over-evaluated because they are repeated several times in primary, secondary, and high school, and others, such as the period known as the event, are barely touched on at all. As I said earlier, the fundamental element of Kanak culture have been added to the program, as have certain Kanak languages. However, this addition raised major issues. The lack of the teacher training. Sometimes we just say to a French or history teacher, okay, you will just teach this. And even sometimes if it's not a Kanak. So the children are sometimes disturbed. If a white man will teach us our culture. Only 18 hours per year for all the subjects, including the languages. And it's added as an extra subject rather than being dealt with on the daily basis in cross-curricular manner. And for the Kanak languages, apart from the fact that French is not the mother language of all the people, to be effective, the teaching of Kanak languages must meet 3 conditions. Proven demand from families, a number of people per group set by the school management to ensure that the cohort remain in the school curriculum, the availability of the teaching resources, so they are therefore not mandatory and not all are available to all the country. So, what the wishes and the initiative from the civil society? Civil society is aware of the weakness in New Caledonian's education system that failed to create a common destiny. Since the 13th of May 2024, there have been numerous debates about overhauling the education system. What emerges? Gaps in graduation rates persist, indicating a failure of existing policies. The education system needs to be adapted to the local realities by integrating Kanak culture rather than relying on imported model. The popular Kanak school, EPK, established during the event as a response to colonial schooling, demonstrate positive outcome. Adapting the system in this way will help incorporate oceanic practices, address absenteeism and language barriers. It is also crucial to present history in a complete and honest manner, avoiding omission and taboos. This requires the involvement of historians and the consensus of all affected communities, some of which may resist revisiting the past. In summary, what stands out is to develop an alternative educational model to Western one, focused on experimental learning and local culture. So what initiatives have been put in place? The co-intervention. So how do you teach when not all the people in class speak the official language used in school? Marie-Laure Rukewe tried the co-intervention, teaching in both languages, the official languages and the language spoken locally. Permaculture Association try a small vegetable garden that combines mathematics, counting seeds, the volume of water and space, the number of days needed, natural sciences, French, learning new vocabulary, and traditional value on the field, EFCK. And I tried the School of Peace team. The aim of this project was to provide playful practical training in conflict management through the prism of peace education and non-violent communication, with the view to the reconciliation between communities. The method is to put the students into concrete situations using fun teaching sheets, which I have personally worked on to make them correspond to the New Caledonian curriculum for primary schools. The aim is to encourage good community living and to emphasize being, doing, and living together by bringing together the different cultures of the territory. So 4 topics are covered: conflict, communication, cooperation, and differences. So for the conclusion, the commonality between all of these initiatives is the fundamental element of the Kanak culture as a cross-curricular manner of teaching, also connecting with different communities. For example, Richard Waminia wrote his thesis on philomatic by putting Kanak culture back at the center of learning mathematics, or telling the story of the event by putting the human process of reconciliation that took place back at the center in order to deal with the Kanak customary way of operating at the same time, even using Kanak languages in history and geography courses. To conclude, a lot has changed, but it seems that the road is not finished yet to build the bridges between all of those memories.
Afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for attending this session. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and future. I'd like to extend the respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, people who might be here with us today this morning. I'd like to thank the organizers for giving me this space to share our experience in education reforms at the Solomon Islands National University. I was just going to come here and do a talk story, or talanoa, as we say. And when we do talk stories, we just bring ourselves with some betel nuts and lime to share with the people who are going to listen to our stories. But unfortunately today, the immigration people wouldn't allow me to bring some betel nuts and limes to share with all of you. So I just put down some talking points after the public lecture by my VC last night to share with you. So I'll just be speaking through the PowerPoint slides that I prepared, being very conscious that I have only 15 minutes. And I'd been reminded by my daughter while preparing my points last night that only 5 slides, 5 talking points, and 5 words per talking point. I did my best to do that. So I'll just take you through my PowerPoint presentation. So my topic is on embracing education reforms and SINU's role in preparing teachers for the future. See, there are 5 slides. I'll begin by looking at a brief context on the need for reform in teacher education, SINU's role in teacher education, our response to the SI Revised Education Act 2023, some issues of concern, initiatives towards transforming SINU teacher education programs, and SINU's role in driving education reforms. Beat me if I say SINU, it's SINU's role in driving educational reform, and a brief conclusion. In terms of context, why the need for reform in teacher education? And I'll be sharing our experience, what's happening in our country, and I hope you can relate to our experience or learn something from our experience in order to also bring changes to teacher education in our own countries. The quality of teacher preparation was a critical concern in the past 2 or 3 decades when I was involved as a teacher educator, teacher education administrator, and a teacher myself. Teachers, many of whom were not professionally trained, relied heavily on traditional methods of teaching. That was one of our concerns in the schools. Recent reforms sought to address this by enhancing teacher training programs and professional development programs. So my faculty is working closely with the Ministry of Education and Development partners to try and bring about changes in order to improve the quality of teaching and learning experiences experienced by our students in our school system. SINU's role in teacher education. SINU was established in 2013 by an act of parliament. And since then, the university, through the Faculty of Education and Humanities, plays a pivotal role in the professional learning and development of Solomon Island teachers. So the bulk of teachers teaching in the Solomon Island school system pass through the Faculty of Education and Humanities, SINU. And SINU supports the implementation of education reforms initiated by the Ministry of Education since way back when I was head of school in the early year 2000, and Rebecca Spratt was an advisor of education with MFAT in the Solomon Islands. So we have been involved in a number of projects to try and support teacher training and development in order to improve the quality of teaching and learning experience in our school system. Response to the Revised Education Act, maybe many of you have seen this in the media. The act, the Revised Education Act, which was passed in October last year, provides an opportunity for key stakeholders of the education system to reflect on current practices and policies and take necessary actions to transform the system. So in our role as teacher educators, we would also like to reflect on our practices, our policies, and contribute towards improvement of quality teaching and learning in our school system. The Act emphasized the right to education for all Solomon Island school-age children and the important role teachers play in achieving this goal. So as a result, we have embarked on a number of initiatives to try and improve our teacher education programs with an aim to prepare teachers who can make a positive impact on students' learning ability and outcomes. Some of the issues of concern at the moment is that there were no research conducted to ascertain the factors that might have contributed to the poor quality of teaching and learning experience by students in our schools. Observations were mainly based on anecdotal evidence and assumptions, limited research on senior teacher graduates performing in schools. So there is a need for us to do some tracking study of our graduates to see how they are performing in schools and come up with strategies on how we could support them or professional support that we could assist them in order to improve in areas that are lacking or areas of concern to stakeholders of our education system. So there were some initiatives towards transformation of SINU teacher education programs, and obviously the first one is to look at our teacher education program. If our teachers are not performing up to expectation, is there a need for us to review our teacher education programs? Is what we are providing through our training programs, providing them with the skills, knowledge and skills for them to be able to provide quality teaching and learning in our schools. The SINU reviews its academic programs on a 5-year cycle. So our teacher education programs are due for review next year. The last review happened around 2019-2020. A major review of a teacher education program is necessary not only to update and upgrade the content of the program, but also to align with MERD reforms under the Revised Education Act. So there is current collaboration with MERD and UNESCO Pacific to integrate the 6 Cs in the primary science teacher training program. We are just piloting this in preparation for a major review of our programs so that we can be able to integrate 21st century skills or transversal skills known as the 6 Cs in Solomon Islands to be integrated into, and this includes skills in communication, effective communication, critical thinking, and creativity that we would like to integrate in our teacher education program so that our teachers will be able to have this impact on our students in the school. So this will be rolled out to all teacher education programs as part of the SNU program review beginning next year. Improvement of the teaching practicum component. As part of the review of our teacher education programs, we would like to review the teaching practicum component to address the concern of our teachers not performing to expectation in the school system. Currently, we have only one teaching practicum segment in our teacher training program, and that happens at the end of the 3-year training of our teachers for the bachelor's program, and at the end of the 2-year diploma program. And we think the current practice is quite limiting in that teachers do not receive quality professional support from the schools they are placed in to do their practicum. And our lecturers who supervise them do not have enough time to provide the professional support they need during the teaching practicum supervision period, because they have quite a big number of students to supervise at one time, and providing the professional support and feedback during that time of supervision is limiting. So we plan, as of next year, as part of our review, to provide opportunities for student teachers to have access to model lessons on different teaching methodologies and how to develop simple teaching resources on locally available materials, improvise where they can, because most of our schools are located in the rural areas. We'd like to provide that opportunity during their training on campus, and for our lecturers to have more time providing feedback, giving practice time and talk story with their students so that they can have that feedback during their training and not only during the one segment of teaching practicum at the end of their programs. The other initiative that we also are planning is the integration of ICT into teacher education programs, enhancing teacher education through the use of ICT, making available teaching resources such as recorded videos or model lessons via Moodle, and enhancing the capacity of our lecturers in the use of ICT is a teaching and learning tool in the school system. And of course, we will have to work closely with the Ministry of Education with this initiative because we do not have the funding to fund this initiative ourselves. So we are currently in discussion with the Ministry of Education and its development partners on how we could be supported to implement this initiative. The fourth initiative is selection of quality candidates for teacher education programs. Since we started, we are faced with the challenge of having to choose amongst average to below average candidates. And this is because students with higher GPAs leaving our year 12 and 13 at the senior secondary school level, they often opt for other professions other than teaching. So I've read in the literature that this is the same situation in other countries as well. So it is a challenge for teacher educators to really get good quality, competitive candidates for our teacher education programs to be trained as teachers for our schools. And in the Solomon Islands in the 90s and early 2000s, they have recruited a lot of untrained teachers to fill in gaps that are left in the school due to shortage of teachers. And that is another challenge itself because as many of you who know Solomon Islands, we have the Wattentok system. Education providers and school principals would just handpick relatives to fill in those gaps and not necessarily based on their on merit or educational performance. So it left a challenge. When we also involve in the training, upgrading of those, we call them teachers in training, in order for them to get a qualification. So for us, a panel led by the head of School of Education is tasked to screen shortlisted candidates to ensure selection of best candidates from the shortlisted candidates. As of next year, we started administering literacy and numeracy tests to new participants to ensure selection of candidates who saw high level of competency in both literacy and numeracy. Language of instruction, as Deborah have already mentioned, in the Act, The revised act states that the local vernacular and pidgin can be used to facilitate learning according to the needs of students, and also English is the principal language of instruction for schools. So our challenge now is the integration of local vernacular or pidgin into our teacher education program, and there are efforts that are being now pursued to strengthen the use of language as the medium of instruction and integrate local vernacular and pidgin into teacher education programs. Development of research culture at SINU is another initiative that we are currently pursuing. There is a need to engage our staff and students in research that will inform practice, not only in teacher education programs, but also in the quality of teaching and learning experience by our students in school. I have very short time left, so I'm running through my slides now. Capacity building for teacher educators, we are also pursuing that. In November this year, the first cohort of lecturers will be coming over to University of Technology, Sydney, to begin training towards a graduate diploma in teaching. And this is to enable them to deliver quality training for our teachers in our school system. So SINU's role in driving educational reforms, leadership in education and innovation, SINU has the potential to act as a catalyst for educational innovation in Solomon Islands by adopting and promoting relevant pedagogies and technologies. SINU can lead the way in transforming the nation's education system, and we've heard that from our VC yesterday. Training teachers for the future, the success of educational reforms hinges on the quality of teachers, and SINU must focus on training teachers who are not only knowledgeable, but also capable of adapting to new educational paradigms and engaging students in meaningful learning experiences. And finally, collaboration with stakeholders. Effective education reforms require collaboration between education institutions, the government of the day, development partners, and the private sector. So SINU must foster these partnerships to leverage resources, expertise, and support for the successful implementation of reforms. Do I still have a few seconds? Just to conclude quickly, SINU is committed to improving the quality of teachers in the Solomon Islands school system through the initiatives currently pursued by the Faculty of Education and Humanities. SINU's teacher education programs are designed to equip student teachers with the knowledge, skills, and attributes necessary to engage students in meaningful learning experiences. SINU endeavors to improve the quality of teachers and teaching in Solomon Island classrooms in collaboration with MED and key stakeholders of the Solomon Islands education system. There are discussions now. We are planning for future projects with DFAT and MED to help us implement the initiatives I've just mentioned. SINU's ultimate goal is to prepare teachers who can provide better educational experience for students in early childhood, primary, and secondary education, not only in Solomon Islands, but we'd like to also train teachers who could go out and teach in the Pacific region and maybe in Australia and New Zealand. Thank you very much.
Here we go. For a session on education, we're not being great educators in the sense that we're just making you sit and listen. But thank you for your patience. Thank you for everyone for being here, and to my great colleague panellists. And also thank you to David for organising all this for us. Kia ora koutou, my name's Rebecca. I'm from Aotearoa, New Zealand originally, and I'm currently based in Melbourne, living on Bunurong land. And I'm really pleased to be here today and to speak with you all on Ngunnawal land. And it always kind of just blows my mind to think that learning and teaching has been happening on these lands for thousands of years, right? And here we are talking about what we've currently learnt about education. Well, anyway, puts things in perspective a bit. So today I'm just going to talk a little bit about my PhD research, which focused on intergovernmental collaboration around education policy in the Pacific. Sounds incredibly boring after such interesting presentations, but hopefully I can keep it interesting for you all. And my research has drawn on my experiences working in and around education development in the Pacific for a few years. And in that time I've been really fortunate to work with wonderful colleagues, including Patricia here. And I just want to acknowledge that it's these relationships and the experiences that I've had that both gave me the impetus for doing my research, but also made that research possible. I couldn't have done it without those relationships. So I just want to acknowledge that. And also why I've chosen to start with this whakatoki, or kind of Māori proverb or saying, just to recognise that everything that I share today is not mine. It's come from the conversations and the sharing that I was very privileged to have with those that I spoke to for my research. And to acknowledge the time that my research participants, the people I spoke with for my research, gave me, and also the mentorship and the learning that I learned through that process. And so what I want to do today is just share a little bit of the story that those I spoke with for my research shared with me. And that is the story of how the Pacific Regional Education Framework, or PACREF, came to be. And perhaps more importantly, why it came to be. That is, what are the desires that motivated those involved with PACREF to bring it into the world as such. And in doing so, I'm going to highlight what seem to be contrasting desires and experiences of this regional policy text and process. And those contrasting experiences is that of PACREF as a Pacific-owned and Pacific-embedded framework for collaboration and for working in a spirit of togetherness, as one of my research participants said. So that experience on one hand, and on the other, PACREF is a source of donor funding for project implementation, to put it in those terms. So through sharing the story, I want to make a broader argument, not necessarily about why regionalism matters or what is worthwhile for or whether regionalism is worthwhile for education development, but rather an argument about what regional education policy makes possible. So first of all, what am I talking about, and what's PACREF? This gives a bit of a snapshot, but it's actually already outdated, and I'm not very good at diagrams, so apologies that I haven't updated it. But this just gives a bit of a snapshot of what we tend to refer to as the regional architecture for collaboration in education in the Pacific. And I don't have time today to go into the history of that collaboration, and it is a long history. But here I focus primarily on the kind of formal structures for intergovernmental collaboration, particularly around pre-tertiary education policies, so primary, secondary schooling, which really kind of took off from about the early 2000s, or 2001 to be exact, when the Pacific Islands Forum organised the inaugural meeting of the Forum Education Ministers, what has come to be known as FEDM, but has since been renamed and reconfigured somewhat as the Council of Pacific Education Ministers. And a key outcome of this inaugural meeting was the Pacific Forum Basic Education Action Plan. And this was a consolidated framework for documenting and directing regionally agreed priorities for education development. And as shown in the slide, you can see that since that first plan, the FEBEP, or however you want to call it, was developed, there's then been a succession of frameworks. So the first one was followed by the Pacific Education Development Framework, which was developed around 2009, and then more recently, and what is now the current framework, the PACREF. And all of these were auspiced by the Forum Education Ministers meeting and developed through various consultative processes, particularly involving the Pacific heads of education systems, which is the meeting and gathering, coming together of the CEOs and directors and permanent secretaries of education systems in the region. And also has always involved also had a lot of involvement from key regional agencies and development partners. And all of these frameworks were explicitly positioned to be Pacific contextualised and to be responses, in a sense, to global frameworks, particularly the Education for All framework and agenda, and now currently the Education 2030 framework is part of or linked to the Sustainable Development Goals. But by the time we got to about 2015, and there was talk of the Pacific Education Development Framework needing to be reviewed and renewed, I think it's fair to say, or certainly as I understand it from those I spoke with, there was a general sense of disappointment and dissatisfaction with what regionalism was delivering for education. And there was a sense that there was a lot of talk, not much impact, and importantly a sense of kind of really genuine ownership or drive from Pacific countries with regard to the work that was happening at a regional level. And of course this was happening at happening at the same time as broader discussions and rethinking about the direction of regionalism generally in the Pacific and the beginnings of what has since become the 2050 Blue Pacific Strategy. So it was around this time that the discussions about PACREF began, and it took nearly 3 years for the framework to get to a point of endorsement by the Forum Education Ministers meeting in 2018. And as I will shortly show, there was the part of the reason this took so long was that there was a sense that it was a very strongly Pacific-led and very consultative process. But it also took that long because it was complemented by a lengthy and somewhat complicated process to seek donor funding for the implementation of what has become to be known as the PACREF program. But before I get to that, I'll just firstly say a little bit about the framework itself. So it's about 20 pages long. It sets out priorities and a set of principles for working in regional education or for collaborating regionally for education. Again, it explicitly links to the SDGs, but there's a lot of emphasis on contextualised approaches and very Pacific-driven approaches. There's a lot of emphasis on South-South collaboration and a desire to make regionalism to work more effectively for education in the Pacific. And yeah, while there's a lot of the activities proposed talk about regional standards and tools, that is always complemented by the emphasis around contextualising it to each country. So the document that was presented to FEDM made a clear distinction between PACREF as a policy framework and an associated PACREF program, which was described as a program of strategies and activities in the 4 policy areas. And that program had quite an elaborate structure for implementation and governance, and was kind of structured around involving what was first identified as the 4 implementing agencies, although a 5th was added at some point along the way. And these agencies are USP, the University of the South Pacific, ECAP, the Education Quality Assessment Program, which is part of the Pacific community, UNICEF and UNESCO, which were interestingly kind of identified as regional agencies, which, you know, we could debate about that, and then also the Australian Pacific Training Coalition, which was also included at some point. So anyway, so the FEDM endorsed it and then also mandated the heads of the education systems, the grouping that supports FED, to try and secure funding for implementation. And this then began a 2-year process led mostly by the implementing agencies to secure global partnership for education funding. And what was interesting about this is that at the time there were 8 countries in the region who were eligible for GPE funding. And there was a whole lot of discussion that went on amongst these countries and with the regional body, the Pacific Heads of Education Systems, to make an argument for allocating that funding to the regional approach, so the regional implementation of PACREF. And after some lengthy discussion, this was agreed on, so by 6 countries. So 6 countries agreed to give up their kind of bilateral funding, their ability to access bilateral funding for GPE, in order to put it towards the implementation of the regional framework. So at that time, that seemed like a real kind of coup for regionalism, right? And it was a very exciting moment for people who had been involved with PACREF and who had been pushing for this regional work to go ahead. And at the same time, there was some really interesting moves happening around developing a more strongly Pacific Indigenous governance framework for the PACREF. The One Solwara platform was developed, as well as a concept of a whānau for the implementing agencies. These were both kind of governing and management, I guess, structures that were established, aligned very strongly with Pacific Indigenous ways of governing and decision-making, allowing for the kind of learning from each other, collaborating with each other, that spirit of working together to come through. So all of this makes it sound kind of interesting. Well, interesting to me anyway, as a researcher, thinking, okay, so, something's happening here, because it was a real contrast to many years of a sense of the regional activities and education not really connecting with Pacific values, really, in some ways, and with the real Pacific priorities. So now I just want to, having given that long spiel of the official story, I want to just share a few quotes that were shared with me through my research about this experience of the PACREF being developed. The first one, I've just lost my place a bit, sorry. The first one being from somebody who was involved right from the start, talking about how it first kind of got onto the table, this idea of the PACREF, and importantly, the idea of the heads of education systems, the CEOs of the ministries of education around the region, to essentially write this document themselves. And you can read the quote there. I won't read it all out for you, unless anyone needs me to. So there's a real emphasis that it was this was us as heads of education systems standing up and taking ownership of this framework. And this was really perceived as something different from what had happened in the past, and as something that was going to be more Pacific. This was going to produce a policy framework, a way of working that was more Pacific in its spirit, but also more Pacific owned. And these quotes here from others who are involved allude to that as well. And this was a strong theme throughout my research conversations, and I'll just point out that I haven't identified any of these quotes in any way, because these sentiments came from people from all different organisations, Pacific and non-Pacific. And I think that's a really important point, because there wasn't, even though often in the literature, I think, and in people's experience, we create a divide between what the Pacific is saying and what donors or outsiders are saying. But through my research, it became quite apparent that there were a mix of views depending on just people's experience. And so this is a quote from Dr. Johansen Fur's recent article on this process, which I would recommend you all to read if you haven't come across it already. I can give the reference later. But just making this argument again about this process and the development of PACREF and the associated kind of conversations and things that happened around it has really been a significant shift in developing a more Pacific grounded approach to the regional framework, and a kind of a step towards decolonisation of the regional kind of policy space. But then we had the other side of the story. So just quickly, because I only have 2 minutes left and lunch is waiting, we have the other side of the story, which was that this was also the same process, which was very much a process that became about getting funding, and through that became a very kind of projectised process, and involved consultants who ended up writing a lot of the documentation that went into applying for the GPE funding that was eventually secured. And I think this quote in particular is quite telling, where the person says, you know, well, yes, we needed funding to make it happen, to be able to do something with this framework, but well, actually maybe not, it depends on what you want it to be. And I think that really sums up the heart of what came through in my research, is that it depended very much on how this, on the desires or what the framework was wanted to achieve for different people. And yeah, just another quote kind of indicating how once it became more of a projectised thing with funding behind it that had to be spent within certain timeframes, it started to actually be experienced by ministries of education as a demand rather than as a source of support or an opportunity for them to collaborate or learn with their colleagues around the region. And again, another quote that is donor-driven. But I think what I want to conclude on is that, yes, there's these two different stories going on and two different experiences, but I'm reluctant to say that the process of securing funding and turning PACREF in some ways into a project that hasn't prevented a lot of good things to happen, basically. And I think this idea of the fact that it created opportunities. So Dr. Kabini Sanga talks about education regionalism as a process of creating these opportunity spaces for togetherness and apartness. And I think that's very much what PACREF did. So even though there was arguably, or it could be easy to say that there was a loss of Pacific ownership through the process of trying to secure funding, that process itself also created opportunities for that continued collaboration and for things like the Wansata Forum and the IA Whānau to continue and to have some impact. I'm going to finish there because I'm out of time. Thank you very much.
Sorry, thank you very much to all the panelists. I'll try and make it quick. It's always refreshing to hear of Solomon Islands, especially Dr. Rode. It's nice to see you again. My question is just specifically to the last speaker. I'm sorry, I've lost your name. And just the background to this question is because I work at USP and I administer some of the generic courses. And to be honest, from the ground feedback towards PACREF, none of us have heard of this. And I've been doing that course for close to the better part of a decade. And the reason why this is a very fascinating panel to me, because you can see it when students graduate, the graduate attributes align with what we're putting out in the course outline. I just wonder to what extent is an institution like mine, if you could reflect back to USP and the region, so to speak, is that sort of seeping down because there's so much disalignment in courses. The talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, all of these particular things. When we look at the course curriculum, it's not there. And I had to teach a generic course where they have to finish this course in order to graduate. So there are two courses. You have the Pacific Studies one, and then of course we've got the Ethics and Governance one. Is there a way, I mean, from your perspective and anybody on the panel, the way in which this has to translate into the ground, because from the front line, the students want to consume it, the contextualization from the regional state level down to the bottom to us, it's a huge gap. And I'm seeing the date of 2018 to 2030. We've been teaching that course since 2011, and I've never seen that particular contextualization and translation. So I wonder if that gap exists, to what extent are implementation agencies, as you've pointed out, that my regional institution is a part of, can connect with us who are sort of teaching on the ground to actually make it make sense and accommodate the traditional knowledge and all these things. If PACREF in itself seems a bit foreign to somebody like me who's in those classrooms every other day. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. And this is some of the disappointment and dissatisfaction that I think I mentioned about some of the regional frameworks and the regional work, yeah? I mean, the interesting thing is that USP is actually the secretariat for the PACREF implementation unit. So the office is on the grounds of USP. And they have a direct relationship into the VC's office, as I understand it. So no comment about USP's internal stuff, but I think it's a really good point, right? Like, and I'm not disagreeing. There is still this kind of disconnect, I guess, between some of these wonderful discussions that are happening at a regional level, or even with our directors and CEOs of ministries of education, and then what's actually happening in classrooms. I like to think that I'm seeing positive shifts, you know, and I think the fact that we are talking about these issues within the regional framework, there's, you know, very explicit focus around bringing Indigenous knowledge into the classroom, working with teachers on that. That didn't used to be there 15 years ago, so that's at least a positive step, I guess, but yep, still a long way to go before that flows on. I don't know if Dr. Patricia wants to say anything, or... Thanks for your question. That's a good one.
I just want to say that I worked for USP for 8 years, and I have the same experience as you. Not aware of when they came around to ask me questions about PACREF, I said, "What? What is PACREF?" And you know what it stands for. So I can relate to what you say. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Fatino Tumapu from Samoa. Congratulations to all the panelists for very comprehensive presentations. I'm trying to put together language, students, schools in one form. Because I represent persons with disabilities, I'm just wondering, with the implementation of the project, has there been any consideration given to teaching language like Braille and sign language to ensure that students who are blind and those who are deaf are educated on an equal basis with other students? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I can comment on the regional space, and maybe others want to add in, but so alongside the development of PACREF, and I didn't touch on this at all because it's a whole other story, there's also the development of a Pacific Regional Inclusive Education Framework that was very much focused about trying to promote education for children, young people with disability, and more inclusive education broadly. As I understand it, this is not my area of expertise, but as I understand it, that has now actually been integrated within the PACREF framework so that it is not siloed on one side and has more dedicated attention. So it is in there, and there are the regional agencies, UNESCO, UNICEF and others are working on inclusive education. The question of how is that impacted at a classroom level goes back to the earlier question. That's still a long way to go, but it is being discussed at least and progressed at that level, I think.
Just speaking on behalf of my institution, I think it's a challenge that we are still grappling with on how we can fully address. Language, in the Act it says use of sign language as well in the education system, and as a teacher training institution, we are grappling with how we could integrate this in our teacher education program. Having facilitators or instructors to provide training for our teachers on Braille or sign language is a challenge, and something that we'd like to discuss further with our ministry and the development partners who support the ministry in education to implement. But we'd like to see this, our teachers equipped with those skills as well. Thank you.
And then we'll call it.
Thanks so much for these fantastic presentations. I'm a PhD student at ANU studying the School to Work Transition and Employment Policy in Solomon Islands and Vanuatu. I would like to ask various presenters, with three of you have Solomon Islands education experience in particular. Thank you so much for your presentations. I was wondering about the large cohort of students who are pushed out of secondary education without completing their educational experience. I'm wondering if you'd like to share your perspectives on whether opportunities and pathways for this large cohort have changed over time in Solomon Islands, recognising that community education, community-based education has long been, has long not had the scale of resources and support that the formal education system has had.
Thanks for that question. One of the things that came through in interviews with people involved in the Kulu Language Institute, which is a place where the folks who've been pushed out have come, at least in Ranonga, is a real anger and disappointment, particularly around young men. So you have a situation, and I've watched this develop over 20 years, where more and more people are getting to secondary school and maybe even finishing, but not coming out with the promise of the end. And I think those young men who looked at their fathers, who got even, a Form 3, Year 9 education and then got work, and now they're getting whatever senior high school and they're not getting the work. It manifests in a kind of sense of, a real loss of sense of self and disappointment, and in their own narratives talking about antisocial behavior, drinking, it just not being, causing vaguely referenced troubles. So in the young men in particular who come to the vernacular language education school, they lament their the trauma that really school failure to go into work causes them, and some find a sense of purpose in the community movement. Young women, it's quite different, because for them, the educational opportunities have increased quite rapidly, and I think they've got a different set of expectations. So that is just reflecting on some of the stories that I've heard by hanging out at Kulu. And Patricia perhaps has a more systematic perspective.
Thank you for that question. Yes, as we aware, those of you who read the literature, the number is increasing by the year. And SINU, in its system, it tries to absorb some of them. We have the University Preparatory College that provides courses for Form 5 leavers, Form 6 leavers, as a pathway towards enrolling into our programs. So we do have that space for school dropouts who would like to go into SINU programs. And the minimum entry requirement for our SINU is year 12, Form 6, unlike USB, which is Form 7, year 13. They can just complete the prelim level, Form 6, and we can accept them into. However, our space is very limited as well. We cannot accommodate everyone. We have that space, as well as we have the online option through our Distance Flexible Learning Center, where they can also pursue doing their literacy or numeracy or science or whatever area they're interested, arts or science, in order to enroll into our certificate or diploma programs. And then they can, if they succeed, they can progress on to our bachelor's program. Thank you.